One snowy morning, I set out to work without having eaten and collapsed in the snow. I was found by the police, who took me home, where I had to remain in bed for several days. The doctor who called advised me strongly to take my husband to live by the sea, and I, willing to do anything to help him, readily agreed. We went to Hastings. Again Hugh tried to work, but his dropsical condition made it impossible. We rented a flat in Hastings, and I began to take in paying guests. But as a result of trying to nurse my husband, look after the children, and take care of the guests as well, my health broke down, and I again had to take to my bed. My husband called in a doctor, a Frenchman, who examined me and made the obvious pronouncement that I needed rest. How well I knew it. But what rest could there be with 4 hungry mouths dependent on my efforts? I had become very thin, and Hugh anxiously pointed this out to the doctor, who replied with true Gallic gallantry, "Did you ever know a thoroughbred horse that was fat?" Life was desperately hard during these years, full of worry, work, and discomfort. But looking back, I am convinced that it was all part of the pattern of things to come. Indispensable training for the work I was to do. If you've not suffered, how can you understand the suffering of others? Without sympathy for those in distress, how can you help to alleviate burdens? At the time, of course, no such thoughts entered my head. I was too busy coping with more immediate problems. Nor indeed did I understand the significance of the presence of the spirit people who continued, as ever, to share my everyday life. They were as much part of my environment as they were ordinary people in the street. The world would have been a strange and empty place if they had suddenly ceased to be there. The months passed. My husband became progressively weaker, until the day I returned home at lunchtime to find 2 of the children standing at his bedside. He was obviously very ill, much worse than when I'd left him that morning. With an overwhelming sense of shock, I knew that he was dying. Quickly, I sent the children to a neighbour who I knew would look after them. Then I sat alone in the room with him and held his hand. He was only spasmodically conscious and did not know what he was saying for much of the time. But every now and then he would have lucid moments, in one of which he said to me, "You'll be all right, darling. God will take care of you." I stayed with him until far into the night. He died while looking at me. At the moment of his passing, I heard strange, terrifying noises coming from the kitchen. It was as though someone was rending linen and every now and then cracking a whip. It was an eerie, uncanny experience, which, coming at that particular time, was unnerving. For some moments I sat unable to move. Then the sound ceased. I looked again at dear Hugh, recalling the happiness we had enjoyed together. And while I sat there, I saw his spirit leave the body. It emerged from the back of his head and gradually moulded itself into an exact replica of his earthly body. It remained suspended about a foot above the body, lying in the same position and attached to it by a cord to the head. Then the cord broke and the spirit form floated away, passing through the wall. I went into the kitchen to get some water to wash his face and hands, and an astonishing sight met my eyes. All the wallpaper on one side of the 12-foot room was hanging from the wall in strips. This then was the explanation of the rending noise which I had heard as my husband died. It was the first physical manifestation of the spirit power I had experienced. But I could not explain the occurrence, yet I intuitively understood its meaning. It was, I believed, a symbol of the rendering of the veil. I had no money to buy flowers, so I took the children to the Downs, where we gathered bunches of little purple flowers, which my husband had loved so well. All of us joined in weaving them into a wreath. On 3 consecutive nights after he died, he called on to me. On the 3rd night, I heard his voice say, "I need you, I want you to come to me." But how, I asked, distraught by grief. By dying? "But darling, I can't do that," I said. "There are the children to take care for." He said no more. The stress of his passing after his long illness must have been great. It was natural that he should want me. He appeared in the room once more before the burial. He said, as if in an apology, "I did not understand. I do not need you now. What you have always told us is right. Here all live on and cannot die. It's quite wonderful." Hugh died in May 1919, 3 days after my 30th birthday. Since the necessity for living by the sea had now gone, I decided to leave Hastings and went to settle with my 3 children in Hampton-on-Thames. Although I had passed through much stress and grief during the 12 years of my marriage, our family life had been a happy and united one, and so it continued. The children, who were now reaching companionable age, bringing me great joy and consolation. I never spoke to them of my spirit people, but inevitably they became aware that I possessed some special insight which they did not share, nor could they understand. It became like a parlour game, when I would predict for their amusement little unimportant things that were going to happen. Sometimes I would startle them by telling them what they had done in my absence. I derived endless amusement from mystifying them, as children always love to be mystified, and they never tire of laying traps to catch me. One of their favourite games centred in an old-fashioned phonograph we owned, which had a large trumpet. The records were in the form of cylinders. The children delighted to bring these cylinders to me, holding them behind their backs, so that I couldn't see them, to test my powers of clairvoyance, by demanding that I tell them the names of the particular cylinders they held. Nearly always I was right, but on the odd occasions when I was wrong, the cheers of triumph from the little ones rang joyously around the house. Again I was faced with the task of supporting a family, and I succeeded in getting work at the Sopwich factory in Kingston. My job was to sew fabric on the ailerons of airplane wings. One day I was asked to sew a canvas boat, which was to be carried by Henry Hawker, Sopwith's chief test pilot, on his attempt to fly the Atlantic. In the course of sewing, I became more and more convinced that the boat would be put to the purpose for which it was intended. The feeling was so strong, I told my friends about it, adding that it would be the means of saving Hawker's life. Nobody paid much attention to my prediction, until it was fulfilled exactly as I had foreseen. Although it was unfortunate that Hawker's bold attempt was unsuccessful, I was nevertheless happy that my sewing had stood to the test. The strain of Hugh's illness, overwork and undernourishment had taken toll on my strength. My health gave out again, and for several months I was unable to do anything in the nature of steady work. I began to despair of ever getting stronger. Necessity, however, is a relentless taskmaster. As soon as I felt I could stand the course, I secured a post as a waitress in the upstairs restaurant at Victoria Station. All the children were now at school all day, so I was free to leave home, but it was a long and wearisome working day. I started at 6 each morning, busying myself with housework and getting the children ready for school. Then I would leave for work at the restaurant and not return home again until 9 or 10 at night. My eldest daughter and a kind neighbour cared for the younger ones, putting them to bed and watching over them until my return. This arduous routine went on until the end of 1920, when I married Arthur Roberts. I was then able to give up my work as a waitress and return gratefully to the duties of a housewife, which also happily meant I could devote more time to my children. My spirit people still came to me regularly, and my understanding of them was growing noticeably. I began to give them much more thought than I had in the past, and even went so far as to discuss them with my next-door neighbour, a Mrs. Slade, who invited me to accompany her to a spiritualist meeting, which she was going to attend. I agreed, and we went to a little spiritualist church at Hampton Hill. This church, I recall, was constructed entirely of tin. We attended 3 times. That's the end of my reading of part 3 of 50 Years as a Medium by Estelle Roberts. Thank you for listening. Take care.